So this video, we're going to look closely at Thomas Stearns Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent, T.S. Eliot. So we got another old school essay here. Let's go to our Eliot essay. Where is it? Where is it? Here we go. Hopefully you've watched the videos for Uncle Harold Bloom's The Art of Reading Poetry, Henri Cole's Oil and Steel. I'm going to be making some additional videos. I know I've said that. I'm not going to be making a video for every poem we're going to read because that would be a lot of videos, but for most of them I will be. All right, let's jump into the essay. Like I said with Harold Bloom's The Art of Reading Poetry, this essay is a good 100 years old here, so it's older. I think some of the things Eliot is putting down are really important and are really still integral to the reading and engaging in poetry. Some of the things, though, kind of like in Bloom's essay, I'm going to disagree with and I'm going to push back on. And some of the poems we're going to be reading go against the grain of what Eliot's saying. So let's jump into the essay. Let's look at the beginning here. In English, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition at most. We employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so and so is traditional or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, it is vaguely appropriative, with implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without the comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. What Eliot's saying in this opening paragraph, in that a lot of times when people in the past here employ the word tradition or traditional, it's as negative connotation. It's a negative. Oh, it's traditional. It's old fashioned. It's just employing these old traditions. Certainly, the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. What Eliot's doing, there are three parts to this essay. The first part, Eliot is looking at tradition and defining it in his terms. Every nation, every race has not only its own creative but its own critical turn of mind, and it is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. We know, or think we know, from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French. We only conclude, we are such unconscious people, that the French are even more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact, as if the French were the less spontaneous. All right, we're going to skip around here a little bit. But we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. Eliot means criticism, but just people talking about art, people talking about poetry, not necessarily criticizing it in a negative sense. Just kind of the talking about it here. One of the facts, I think this is an important part of this second paragraph. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his, her, or their work in which he, she, or they least resembles anyone else. Someone who is individual, someone who is so unique. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is the peculiar essence of the poet. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of their work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. What Eliot's saying here is a lot of times we praise a poet, an artist, an individual for their complete uniqueness. However, a lot of times their practice is hinged and predicated upon how they have taken what has come before, put it within their work, and made it new through that lens. Here's where Eliot really defines tradition and what it is for its importance. Yet, if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should be positively discouraged. What he's saying here is, if we only take what has come before us and attempt to do the same things, then it is bad. It's not good, right? We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. Here's where he's defining what makes it great. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. Here's his definition. It cannot be inherited, and if you want, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his or their 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only the pastness of the past, but of its present. The historical sense compels a person to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. All right, that's what Eliot is saying about tradition. In some ways, we have to know what has come before us. This is echoing Bloom a little bit, right? That it's we have to know the history of poetry in order to write singular great poetry, but we're not merely imitating what has come before. We're taking all that has come before and using it to make our own unique vision. Think about this. Think about poems, songs, any art that you encounter. If you want to make something on your own, right, you subsume that and invest in your own the best of that. That's what this is, a historical sense. You need this historical sense too. You got to know what's come before. You have to have read the poems. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of the place and time of his contemporaneity. What makes the poet new, fresh. This is important. Think about this. And I want to know if you agree, disagree, or want to fight about it. No poet, no artist of any art has their complete meaning alone. Right? Is that true? Don't we, we're talking poetry here, but think of any genre of art. It's always in relation and comparison to other artists of anything, right? Their significance, their appreciation is the appreciation of their relationship to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he, she, they shall conform, they shall cohere is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new work of art among them. So you're taking the past, taking the historicity, taking the history, and making it new with the new work, right? And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities, right? Think of this, great difficulties and responsibilities. In a peculiar sense, they will be aware also that they must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them. Not judged to be as good as or worse or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison, in which two things are measured by each other. And this is why, back to, you're making it new, taking the past and making it new. To conform would be for the new work, not really to conform at all. It would not be new, right? So let's keep going. We're going to jump around a little bit. So you've gotten what makes tradition so important to Eliot here. Right here. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, they can neither take the past as a lump an indiscriminate bolus, nor can they form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, right? The first course is inadmissible, the second is an important experience of youth, and the third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main current. You got to know what's going on in the present, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. They must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, and I'm thinking, remember that echo in Bloom, when someone would argue, everything's been done, everything's been said before. Not that that's necessarily true, but we need to say it in new, different, unique ways, right? This is important. Someone said the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did precisely, and they are that which we know. At the end here, what is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he, she, they should continue to develop this consciousness throughout their career. We have to know what's come before us. We have to have read everything and infused what's new with that. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. This is where our paths might diverge a little bit from Eliot. And I'm fascinated with what he says here. I want us to close read this, because what Eliot is saying is that we need to extinguish the personality, extinguish the individual. Whereas I get what he's saying in that, each individual's life shouldn't come before the art. However, I don't know if those things are mutually exclusive. Let's look at this, though. Let's look what Eliot says here. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet, but upon the poetry. That's true, right? We're looking at Henri Cole's poetry, not Henri Cole the person. If we attend to the confused cries of the newspaper critics and the susurrus of popular repetition that follows, we shall hear the names of poets in great numbers. Let's walk through this a little more. I tried to point out right here. I tried to point out the importance of the relation of the poem to other poems by other authors, and suggested the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. The other aspect of this impersonal theory of poetry is the relation of the poem to its author. And I hinted by an analogy that the mind of the mature poet differs from that of the immature one, not precisely in any valuation of personality, not being necessarily more interesting or having more to say, but rather by being a more finely perfected medium in which special or very varied feelings are at liberty to enter into new combinations. All right, that's a mouthful, but let's zero in on what Eliot's saying here. We could say a poet may be able to convey emotions, feelings, thoughts that are expressive and indicative of individuality. What's important, and I have it highlighted here, is to say these feelings in new combinations. Make it new. We don't want to be told what we already know. I mean, a lot of us do. Think of this. This is why certain poems might frustrate people. We have to think about them. To look at things we know, feelings we have, experiences we have experienced in new and unique ways. That's the goal of the poet here, right? It may be partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the man himself, but the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him, her, them, will be the person who suffers in the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. All right. Emotions and feelings. We talked about that a little bit here. I think the next component is pretty important. We have Eliot using some specific examples here, right? We have Dante. He's looking at Dante. You can click on that. I think there's a link to it. Look at Dante, and he says specifically, last quatrain gives us an image, a feeling attaching to an image which did not develop simply out of what precedes, but which was probably in suspension in the poet's mind, until the proper combination arrive for it to add itself to. So we have that moment here. It is not the greatness of intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak. So it's not just emotions. A poet I like, Richard Seikin, says, just because you have feelings doesn't make you an artist, right? One must take those feelings and turn them stylistically, formally, aesthetically into great art. And Eliot gives other specific examples here. We have Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, which we'll be reading at the end. Here, though, let's look at this. The point of view which Eliot is struggling to attack is that perhaps related to the metaphysical theory of the substantial unity of the soul, for any meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Here it is. So, back to what I was saying, and Eliot's echoing, I think it's not just simply the obliteration of a personality. It's just impressions and experiences in peculiar and unexpected ways, right? And here's a passage he quotes. It's not his personal emotions that the poet is in any way remarkable or interesting. The emotion in his poetry will be a very complex thing, but not with the complexity of the emotions of people who have very complex or unusual emotions in life. The business of the poet, right here, this is really important. The business of the poet is not to find new emotions, because is that possible, but to use the ordinary ones, and in working them into poetry, to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. And emotions which he has never experienced will serve his turn as well as those familiar to him. So it's taking things and expressing them in different ways. Again, I don't know if we can completely subsume identity and personality. Similarly to what Bloom is arguing, Eliot's arguing those shouldn't be the driving forces, that there has to be artistic merit within those as well. There is a great deal in the writing of poetry which must be conscious and deliberate. In fact, the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious, and conscious where he ought to be unconscious. Both errors tend to make him personal. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion. Think of this right here, right? But an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. We'll be testing this. I agree on certain things and I disagree on certain things. I think, if we go back to Cole's Oil and Steel and Chiffon Morning, there is personality there. However, I also agree that the speaker and the poet is expressing emotions that we know in interesting and unique ways. An anti-preacher, right? Think of moments from Chiffon Morning where the poet is thinking of his life juxtaposed with his surroundings. That's basically the overarching thoughts and tradition in the individual talent, right? The ending is very important here, but very few know when there is expression of significant emotion which has its life in the poem and not the history of the poet. The emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering themselves wholly to the work to be done. Tradition's important, Eliot's saying, but not simply for knowing it and regurgitating it and mimicking it exactly. To subsume, to take what has come before and transform it into something new. Kind of like what Bloom was saying, the importance of the work is on the form, the style, the content, the artistic merit behind it, more so than strict personality. And however, I'm going to argue those things can never be completely separated. And as I mentioned before, we're going to be reading a bunch of poems that push back against this, and I think do two things at once. So we'll be getting into those next. We'll be looking at some of Hart Crane's poems.